you very much for talking to AP. You've been here observing voluntary defence training, and we talked a little bit earlier about the concept of Sisu, which is this Finnish idea of endurance and resilience. What lessons do you want other countries to learn from the Finnish approach to endurance, resilience and towards Russia?
Well, Sisu, I think, is a key word, part of our identity, even part of our DNA. And I guess we define it as grit and perseverance. And it's been part of our psyche, I think, throughout our history, when we were part of Sweden, when we were part of Russia, and when we gained independence in 1917. And especially it became almost a mythical concept during the Winter War and the War of Continuation, when the conditions were very difficult. And we've kept it ever since, and I think kids are taught it very early on in school that, don't give up, just keep on grinding through, even if it's tough. To be honest, today the conditions here have been sunny and lovely and the rest of it, so you didn't see any real grit. But when the going gets tough, Finns huddle up and use Sisu as their main instrument.
It seems that you could use that also when it comes to negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine and getting a deal there, because things around Ukraine at the moment seem to have stalled slightly. What levers would you like to see pulled in the US and also in Europe to get President Putin to negotiate?
Well, first of all, I think the Ukrainians are showing a lot of Sisu, a lot of grit and perseverance, and they've been in a war mode for almost 4 years. I'm not very optimistic about achieving a ceasefire or the beginning of peace negotiations, at least this year. I mean, perhaps if we get something going by February, March, that would be good. But in the meanwhile, I think we need to maximize the pressure on Russia and on Putin. We need to change his strategic thinking, which hasn't changed since the beginning of the war. He basically wants to deny the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. But we need two things. One is financial support to Ukraine, and I think the best thing we can do there is to use the 140 to 180 billion euros of frozen assets that are lying with Euroclear, at least as a collateral, and that will get Ukraine over the over the winter time. And the second thing we need to do is increase the military pressure, and that means that we continue not only to finance military equipment, but to donate as we best can. I've had countless conversations with the President of the United States, and as we all know, he has two leverages, or negotiating tactics. One is carrot, the other one is stick, and I'm afraid that with Putin, the only thing that works is stick. He won't come to the negotiating table unless he has to.
What sticks would you like President Trump to start using that he hasn't already?
Well, I think he did an excellent job in putting Lukoil and Rosneft on the sanctions list, because that puts the Russian oil industry under pressure, which basically puts the machine that finances the war under pressure. So we need to get Russia to feel the economic consequences of this war. The other thing is, of course, to give Ukraine as much firepower as it can get. And I know the Ukrainians are negotiating with the Americans. I think at some stage we got a bit too sort of focused on the tomahawks, but there are other things to do as well. I think what we need to do is to give Ukraine the capacity to hit the military or defense industry of Russia, and whatever equipment then is needed for that. I think that's the key.
Does Europe have any cards to play when it comes to that? Or aside from President Zelensky, does this all hinge on a negotiation between Presidents Trump and Putin?
No, I think Europeans have leverage as well. And then it's a question of at what stage. So far, we've been working very closely with President Trump. Time goes and runs by fast. Remember that President Trump, got elected only in 2023 and 2024 and hasn't been in office for that long yet. and he has obviously accelerated the negotiations. And what we basically do is we give messages to the President of the United States. By we, I mean European leaders. And then, of course, we interpret President Trump to President Zelensky and vice versa. And I think it's probably best to have one contact point at this time, and that's Trump on the highest political level. But it is clear that the rest of us have then other types of relations which don't feed to the highest echelons of power in the Russian Federation.
President Trump has swung back and forth this year towards seeking rapprochement with Putin and also then applying pressure. Some of those shifts can be quite stark. How do you personally handle that?
Well, I think in peace mediation in general, you have to be quite patient, and you have to sort of live with the reality. So you can't have illusions about things that you would like to see happening. You can try to have an impact on them. So I've tried personally to focus on things such as, okay, we need security guarantees for Ukraine. How do we build those? We need a ceasefire. How can we get that? Perhaps we begin the ceasefire at a contact line. How do we get there? Been focused on if and when the peace negotiations begin, what are the parameters? So it's a bit of a grind, I guess. You need Sisu in these types of negotiations as well. I myself don't consider myself to be the most patient person in the world, but I think when it comes to diplomacy, I do quite well on that front.
A former senior American military official in Europe told me that he thinks President Trump might be a little bit scared of you because you're taller, fitter, and a better golfer.
I don't know. I think we're about the same height. We have an age difference, obviously, but I'd still put Trump as a pretty good golfer. I think better than me. So
even though you had a golf scholarship in the US.
Yeah, but I stopped playing for 35 years. Now I'm trying to catch up. I have to admit, I don't know if I should be thankful or not, but I've really gotten into golf again. But the key is that golf is a good social sport. And, you know, my dad told me when I was aspiring to become a professional that, you know, Alex, even if you don't become a professional, golf will come in handy at some stage in your life. And I just thought that was Dad's way of saying that, you know, spend more time in the library than the driving range. But of course he was right, because for me the biggest door opener was around with the President of the United States. You have to realize I come from a small country, and for someone from a small country to spend pretty much 7 hours with breakfast and lunch included with the President of the United States is a big thing. And yeah, I enjoy golf, but no, he's not afraid of me. I mean, he's the most powerful man in the world. And I keep on saying that I don't want to inflate my own role, because in all honesty, a country like Finland, we're in the back office. We can interpret a situation. I can explain to President Trump what Finland went through, or how I see the situation on the battlefield, or how do you deal with Putin. And then, you know, if he accepts 1 out of 10 ideas, that's good.
Do you think then that relationship you have, maybe perhaps more in private than in public, allows you to actually sway his thinking and explain the European position to him and kind of bring him more towards the European side?
I think anyone who knows President Trump, he is actually a very curious person. He asks you a lot of questions, but then at the end of the day, there's only one person in that country making the decisions, and that's the President of the United States himself. Again, I come back to my earlier point that I don't want to inflate my role in any which way. We are in contact on a fairly regular basis, but he's in a contact with a lot of people. And I just see this more as normal diplomacy. And for me, it's very important that we in Europe work in unison. So I also appreciate my relationship with the President of France, with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, with the Chancellor of Germany, or with the Prime Minister of Italy, or Prime Minister and President of Poland. And for me, it's just normal diplomacy, and the fact that I've been able to have a relationship is good. The relationship that I really work on a lot is the one with President Zelensky. I respect him a lot, and I feel that we are personally very close. We talk with each other on the phone at least once a week, sometimes more often, and I admire a lot of the things that he's doing, because to lead a country in a war, a country which is existential, you learn a lot from other human beings in that situation.
President Zelensky right now is dealing with the fallout of a major corruption scandal in Ukraine, which has possibly undermined Ukraine's energy defences. Will this damage European and American support for Ukraine, do you think?
I think it's something that President Zelensky has to sort out very quickly, and he has started doing that. I haven't spoken about this particular case earlier, but obviously there's no place for corruption, especially in a country which is in war. And it does then, I think, play into the cards of a country like Russia, which of course is corrupt by definition. So I hope that things get sorted and cleared, and then we can continue our work in defending Ukraine.
President Trump has been trying to bring about another meeting with President Putin in Budapest, which then obviously got cancelled. In your understanding, why did it get cancelled and why did it not happen?
Well, I think it got cancelled because President Trump and his team realized very quickly that Russia is not interested in a ceasefire or in peace. So we saw that first in Alaska, and secondly we saw it in the phone conversation that he had a couple of weeks back. And then when Foreign Secretary Rubio and Foreign Minister Lavrov had a phone conversation about setting out the agenda and the modalities of the Budapest meeting, I think the Americans quickly realized that the Russians haven't moved an inch. And we have to remember that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been in the business of Soviet and Russian diplomacy for over 30 years and Foreign Minister for over 20. He's probably the only person that knows every international treaty in this world in its minute detail. So when he puts out his spiel in fluent English, it's a record which is very difficult to stop. And I think that probably Marco Rubio realized that no point in taking President Trump into a situation whereby he doesn't get a deal or anything out of that meeting. That was probably the reason that it got cancelled. I think it was yet another example of a strategic mistake by the Russians. They had an opportunity and they blew it.
There's a narrative in the media which is that Sergei Lavrov messed up. Do you think that he messed up, or do you think that actually the Russians knew exactly perhaps what they were doing and they gave the message, which to your point they've always given?
Well, for me as a Finn, that's kind of an important but at the same time irrelevant question, in the sense that this is what Russia does. You know, we've negotiated with Russians throughout our history. There's always a negotiating position. And then there is a glimmer of light where they give hope we could move, and then boom, they retract again. They're very skillful at this. So I think our base case is that Russia will not come to the negotiating table voluntarily. And the thing that is very difficult for us in the West to understand is the cost of human life that they're willing to pay to drive forward this absolutely senseless war. Remember that Russia has advanced 1 percentage point of Ukrainian territory in the last 1,000 days. And we're talking, depending on who you ask, which intelligence services you deal with, of casualties or dead, 5,000 to 7,000 per week. So we're talking, over 1 million Russians that have been either killed or wounded in this war. And you have to ask yourself the question, for what? Mm-hmm. In World War II, Stalin was in Berlin in 4 years. We're almost 4 years into the war, and Russia is nowhere near Kyiv, and they're not going to get there. So you have to ask yourself a question that, what will then bring Russia to the negotiating table? And at this stage, I don't know. I think it all revolves around at least 3 questions. One is security guarantees, especially for Ukraine. Second one is the economy. How do you deal with that? And then the third one is land. And then we'll see how it all pans out.
Regarding the security guarantees, they're obviously only going to be implemented once there is a ceasefire and a period of peace in which European and Western forces can support Ukraine. What have the Americans said that they will commit? Because I know the military meetings have been ongoing regarding that.
Well, I think there are two elements of the security guarantees. One is military and operational, and we are already pretty much there. Our chiefs of defense have done their job.
What does pretty much there mean?
It means that the setup is clear. So we know who is going to do what, when, where, and how. But
Can you elaborate on that at all?
No, because they are military operations, which we don't, say. But I feel quite comfortable about the commitments that have come from different countries. But the second part is perhaps the more political one, and there I think the setup is very clear. The bulk and key elements of security, that's Ukraine and the Ukrainian military, which is 800,000 strong, the most modern and efficient military in Europe. Then the basic support for that comes from Europe in one way or another. And then the backstop comes from the United States. And of course, the United States would be very useful in things linked to intelligence, which they already do now very effectively, as we know. And then air defense in one way or another. But these are questions that we deal with once the ceasefire is in place, and we're not there yet. That's why we now have to focus on the essentials, in other words, the short term, and that is the military and financial support that we need to continue to pour into Ukraine, either directly one-on-one or then via what we call the Pearl, where we purchase American military equipment and then give it to Ukraine.
Your predecessor, President Sauli Niinistö, said that the EU should open a direct line of communication with President Putin because otherwise it risks being overlooked. Do you think that the EU should do that? And do you worry that if President Trump is the only one dealing with President Putin, that the EU may be overlooked? Well,
obviously, European leaders have been dealing directly with Putin. The bad examples in my mind are Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia and Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. That's very much a solo affair. And then there have been better examples with more or less coordination coming from former Chancellor Scholz and especially President Macron. I don't see this as a new proposal. We've been discussing the opportune time to open communication channels. And as we all know, there are two sorts of channels. One are public. If that were to take place, I think the key there is that we work as Team Europe. In other words, we coordinate and then decide who talks with Putin. And the other one are informal channels. And, they have already been reports in international media of other informal channels taking place. So at some stage we'll open communication channels, but it's all about timing, and I don't see that happening anytime very soon.
You said very recently in a speech that we've moved on to a new nuclear age. How worried and concerned are you about the threat from Russia?
Well, I think the thing with nuclear weapons is that the more you talk about them, funnily enough, the less there is a threat. Because it's very unlikely that nuclear weapons will ever be used. We know the consequences too seriously. And if we all recall that President Putin was threatened with nuclear weapons early on in the war, and basically he was then told by China and India and others to tone down his language. What I mean by a new nuclear age, basically nuclear age 3.0, is that the technology evolving around nuclear weapons is quite easy to acquire. Nowadays we have, depending on how you count, 9 to 10 nuclear powers, and my big worry is that some of the key nuclear containment agreements that we've had START, among others, are running out. And I think it would be very important for the key nuclear powers to discuss, missiles and different arrangements. And of course, it's different in the sense that the nuclear age 2.0 was between the Soviet Union and the United States, but now we have another major nuclear power in the game, China. So I hope that we can start understanding paradoxically that this discussion about nuclear war should actually then lead to peace and controlling nuclear arms in the future.
On the one hand, there's a need to an extent to engage with President Putin, but on the other hand, you know, in Europe, there have been incursions of drones, fighter jets, and allegations of a widespread Russian sabotage campaign. How do you think Russia can be contained and the threat dealt with in the long term?
Be Finnish. In other words, be cool, calm and collected and have a little bit of that Sisu. Because right now Russia is conducting two types of warfare. One is kinetic and conventional, the one that we see in Ukraine. And the other one is hybrid. And of course, on the hybrid side, there's so many different ways basically to instrumentalize or weaponize things that were supposed to bring us together. And in Finland, we've had three examples there of at least. One is on the land, and that's instrumentalizing asylum seekers, so basically sending them over our borders without a real necessity. Well, we've legislated, haven't had to use that legislation yet, but that basically stopped that. So we haven't had those incidents in about a year and a half. The second one is in the sea. That's basically underwater cables. We had an example on Christmas Day last year, which we were able to deal with very quickly. And now we have a Baltic Sentry operation with NATO, and we haven't seen any cable cutting anymore. And the third one has been with violations of airspace or drones. And now we put a Eastern Sentry operation through NATO, and those have come down. Now, with hybrid warfare, the problem is that you can never stop it completely because it is so unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But you have to be able to set up defense systems and deterrents that you're prepared, and then that you can immediately repair any damage that has taken place. But I do think there's one more element there. And this is where I think Finnish Sisu or calmness comes in, that, you know, don't panic. These things happen in today's world. If you overreact, you kind of reveal your cards. You have to find the right way to react, deal with it, and then move on.
Not all incidents are public of hybrid warfare, including attacks on critical infrastructure and attempted assassinations. Do you think that countries should be more ballsy at calling these things out, or do you think they're a bit afraid because it's hard to muster a response?
I think the approach there is that if you are pretty much 100% sure, attribute. But if you are 50% sure, indicate. And if you're only 25% sure, don't call it out. And in some of these cases it's complicated, but in some it's quite straightforward, as we have seen, for example, in assassination cases, Skripal and others. But some are a little bit more complicated. I mean, let's say sea cables, undersea cables. So there are kind of three options there. One is incompetence, which, you know, happens. These ships just drop an anchor and they don't notice. The other one is intent or malintent, which is obviously serious. But the worst one is a combination of the first two, that you're both incompetent and malintent. In other words, you hit the wrong target. But we've taken a decision that unless it's 100% sure, we don't attribute. But if it's 50, we sort of indicate what has happened.
With the sea cables, though, it's particularly difficult, isn't it? Because so far, as I understand, no one has actually come out and drawn a direct link with the Russian state.
No, because I think the Russian state quite often uses proxies. You know, for example, on just basic sabotage or blowing up a factory somewhere, they just, you know, use a poor guy somewhere on the street in Central Eastern Europe and say, we'll give you this money if you go and do that. Then Is it directly state? Well, if it is, of course, Russian rubles changing hands, then yes. So, it's quite complicated, but I think so far we've been able to contain it quite well. But we also have to keep in mind that what Russia tries to do is destabilize. They aim to cause havoc and panic. They do that with these hybrid attacks, but also with information wars. And that's where I keep on saying that, don't react to everything that comes out of Russia. There's always going to be someone testing you, publicly or otherwise. So far, I think we've been able to navigate quite well.
Is Europe, in a way, already, to an extent, at war with Russia?
No, I don't think so. I think we can say that the line between war and peace has been blurred. The things that were supposed to bring us together, trade, currency, interdependence, they can now be used as instruments of war as well. But if the question is, are we in a traditional, kinetic, conventional warfare? No. But is there hybrid warfare? Yeah, definitely. Cyber attacks are a good example thereof, and it's just very important for us to keep our defenses up. That's why you see a country like Finland, which strongly believes in comprehensive defense. So when I, as President and Commander-in-Chief, sit on all the relevant information which has to do with Finland's security, it's not only about military power, it's not only about the capacity of our border guard, our police, or our security of supply, or these types of voluntary trainings. The more I see, the more calm I am about the situation, and I sleep my nights very well, because I know that if there's one country in Europe that is prepared for any type of an event, it's Finland.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it. Thank you.